All right, today we're diving into some Cold War history,
Okay.
but we're not talking spies and nuclear weapons this time.
Right.
We're going a little more, I guess you could say, digital.
Okay.
We're talking about OGAS. You familiar with OGAS?
I am. Yeah, the Soviet Union's attempt to kind of get ahead of the game
Yeah.
with a nationwide computer network. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, this is their internet, so to speak, before, the internet.
Exactly, exactly. It really captures the imagination because you can kind of see how things could have gone very differently.
Yeah.
If things had gone another way,
Yeah.
we could be talking about, the OGAS system that we all use today, but
But we're not.
we're not.
So let's get into it. Who was
Well,
the architect behind this whole thing?
this was the brainchild of Viktor Glushkov,
Okay.
who was a brilliant, really forward-thinking computer scientist working in the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And he dared to dream. He dared to imagine a future where technology could revolutionize the way that the Soviet economy worked.
So this is the 1960s. We're talking about the USSR, a nation dealing with a
Right.
very complicated, centrally planned economy. What
Yeah.
made them even think about doing this in the first place?
It's a great question because it really speaks to, I think, the challenges that the Soviet Union was facing at the time.
Okay.
After the Second World War, the Soviet economy grew very rapidly.
Right.
And it was able to keep pace with a lot of kind of, Western economic development.
Sure.
But as time went on and as things got more complex,
Yeah.
that task of central planning, of trying to coordinate production, resource allocation
Right. Across 11 time zones.
across 11 time zones
Yeah.
with thousands of factories and farms and enterprises,
Yeah.
it just became incredibly difficult. They were really facing a challenge of scale more than anything else, and the traditional methods that they were using just weren't keeping pace.
So Glushkov saw an opportunity
Yeah.
to maybe use computers to kind of
He wanted to wrangle
this beast.
That's a great way to put it, yeah, because it was this kind of, massive complex system that, even with the best intentions, it was very difficult to manage.
Right.
And so Glushkov comes along and he says, you know what?
Yeah.
A computer could maybe wrap its arms around this and get it under control. And OGAS, which stands for a Nationwide Automated System, was born.
Now, Glushkov wasn't just an
No,
armchair quarterback here. He wanted to really get into the weeds,
absolutely.
figure out how to actually make this work.
He understood that for a system like this to work, it had to be grounded in reality.
Right.
And so he spent years going out visiting factories, mines, government institutions, over 1,000 different places he personally visited to really understand the challenges that they were facing, the way that things actually worked on the ground.
So he's gathering data, basically.
That's exactly what he's doing. Yeah. And it was an enormous undertaking, especially for that time.
Yeah.
If you think about the lack of,
Right.
easy communication, easy travel
Right.
that they had back then. I mean, this was a real labor of love for him.
It was a deep dive before we even had that term.
Exactly. Exactly.
So let's get into the system.
Yeah.
What were the nuts and bolts? What would it have actually looked like?
So picture this. A network of over 100
Okay.
massive computing centers
Wow.
spread out across the Soviet Union.
Okay.
These were called EGSVTs.
Right.
And they were going to be connected by high-speed communication lines.
Okay.
And this was essentially going to be the backbone.
So this is basically the proto-internet.
The proto-internet, yeah, specifically designed for managing an economy.
Right. Not for looking at cat videos.
Okay.
Exactly.
So these EGSVTs,
Yeah.
I mean, they're nerve centers, they're
Right.
data collection points.
Data collection, data processing.
Okay.
So they're kind of the brains of the operation spread out across this vast territory.
Okay, but how would they actually manage the economy? What's the secret sauce?
The secret sauce was a system called Displan.
Displan.
Displan. It's actually a Russian abbreviation,
Okay.
which translates to Dialogue System of Planned Calculations.
So it's interesting that they use the word dialogue
That's a really good point.
because it kind of makes it sound like it's a back and forth. It's not just
That's exactly right.
top down.
Yeah, this wasn't just about, some central computer spitting out orders.
Right.
This was about trying to create a system where human planners and this incredible computational power could actually work together, could have a kind of a conversation.
So this is incredibly ambitious for the time.
Hugely ambitious. I mean,
Yeah.
did they think they had a chance?
I mean, they were facing an uphill battle
Okay.
on a number of fronts.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, technologically,
Right.
this was a huge undertaking.
It is all mainframes.
Mainframes, exactly. I mean, these were massive,
Yeah.
ream-sized computers
Right.
that were very, limited in their capabilities compared to what we have today.
Yeah.
And just the task of connecting them, the communication infrastructure.
Right. And the cost.
And the cost. Absolutely, this would have been a massively expensive undertaking.
Even for the Soviets.
Even for the Soviets, and this is a key point, right? Because
Yeah.
it wasn't just the technological challenges that OGAS faced.
So it sounds like maybe this was as much a political project as a technological one.
It absolutely was. To really understand why OGAS ultimately failed, I think you have to look beyond the blueprints and the algorithms
Yeah.
and really understand the political and ideological landscape of the Soviet Union at the time.
Okay, so this sounds like this is a story for part 2 of our deep dive on OGAS.
It sure is.
But first, let's take a quick break. So before the break, we were talking about how OGAS wasn't just about managing the Soviet economy as it was, but maybe even kind of steering it into the future.
Yeah, Glushkov had this really interesting idea.
Okay.
It was called the predictive tree method. And the basic concept was to create this system for forecasting technological advancements.
Okay.
And they would do this by tapping into the collective wisdom of, the brightest minds in the country, scientists, engineers, people like that.
So kind of crowdsourcing the future?
In a way, yeah, but with a very structured approach.
Okay.
Glushkov was convinced that technological progress wasn't random.
Right.
It followed patterns built upon existing knowledge.
Right.
So he thought if you could systematically gather insights from the leading thinkers in different fields,
Okay.
you could then use that data to create these incredibly accurate forecasts of where technology was headed.
It's like he was trying to build a time machine for technology.
It's really mind-blowing when you think about it. This is the late 1960s we're talking about.
Right. No internet, no personal computers as we know them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was already grappling with the challenges of information overload,
Wow.
trying to wrangle all that knowledge and expertise and turn it into something useful. It's a challenge we still face today.
Absolutely. But it also kind of makes you wonder if OGAS was so ahead of its time, so potentially transformative, why wasn't it ever built?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, what went wrong?
Well, as we touched on earlier, it wasn't just about the technology. There were these massive political and ideological hurdles that Glushkov couldn't overcome.
So it's more about the system than the system itself.
Exactly. OGS challenged the very foundations of how the Soviet system operated.
Okay, so like what? Give me some specifics.
Well, for starters, OGS was all about data sharing transparency.
Okay.
And that made a lot of people in power very nervous.
I can see why nobody wants to give up their information.
It's exactly. Ministries and committees had their own little fiefdoms of information and control.
Right.
OGAS threatened to disrupt all of that.
So it was about control there.
Control and power. The lifeblood of any bureaucracy.
I guess some things never change.
Right. But it went deeper than just bureaucratic turf wars.
Mm-hmm.
There are these deep-seated ideological anxieties at play, too.
Like what?
Well, remember, this is the Cold War.
Yeah.
The height of ideological rivalry between the Soviet Union and the West.
Right. The U.S. versus them, capitalism versus communism.
Exactly. And the idea of a machine, a computer, playing a central role in economic planning.
Okay.
That tapped into some very real fears about automation, about the role of human judgment in a socialist society.
So they saw it as a threat to their ideology.
In a way, yes. Some people within the Soviet system portrayed OGAS as this dangerous step toward a dystopian future where machines ruled over humans.
That's pretty ironic when you think about it. Today we're worried about algorithms being biased about reinforcing existing inequalities.
Right. It's like the fear was the opposite back then.
Mm-hmm.
They were afraid that a system like OGAS would be too rational, too objective.
Too cold and calculating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how those anxieties have shifted over time.
It really makes you wonder if there are any lessons we can learn from this whole OGAS saga. I mean, here's the story from the Cold War about a failed attempt to build a digital state.
Right.
But it feels strangely relevant to the challenges we're facing today.
It absolutely does.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest takeaways from the OGAS story
Yeah.
is that technology is never neutral. It's always shaped by the social, political, and ideological forces of its time.
So it's not just about the technology itself, but about how we choose to use it.
Exactly. And that's a lesson we need to keep in mind as we navigate the complexities of the digital age.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about the vision behind OGAS. We've talked about the political and ideological roadblocks that ultimately led to its downfall.
Right.
But what about the practical challenges? I mean, even if Glushkov had managed to get everyone on board, could they have actually built this thing?
That's a great question, and it's one that historians and technologists are still debating today.
So Glushkov's vision ran into a wall.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of sad, right?
Yeah.
This really ambitious project kind of sunk under its own weight, but
Yeah.
it's hard to say what might have happened if he had gotten everyone on board.
Right. What if he had managed to push past all those political and ideological roadblocks?
Right.
Could they have actually pulled it off?
I mean, that's the million ruble question, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
even with today's technology, building a system like OGAS would
Yeah.
be a massive undertaking.
Oh, absolutely.
So trying to do it back then with the technology they had,
With mainframes.
mainframes exactly.
Mm.
I mean, these things were
Yeah.
huge. They were unreliable. The communication infrastructure was
Yeah.
primitive at best. And then you've got the cost.
Right. I mean, could the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
even with all of their, might, could they have actually afforded it?
That's a huge factor. Even if they had managed to, overcome all the other challenges,
Right.
the sheer cost of building and maintaining a system like OGAS
Yeah.
might have been just impossible to sustain.
So maybe it's a moot point.
It's really hard to say.
Yeah,
It's one of those great what-ifs of history, isn't it?
it really is.
But I do think there's a bigger takeaway here.
Okay.
And it's something that we talk about a lot on this show,
Okay.
which is that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right. Right.
It's always shaped by the context in which it's created.
The people, the politics.
The people, the politics, the ideologies, all of that.
Yeah.
And sometimes even the most brilliant ideas, the most
Mhm.
groundbreaking technologies, they can fall flat
Right.
if conditions aren't right.
If the world isn't ready.
Exactly. Exactly.
So maybe Glushkov was just ahead of his time.
Maybe, yeah. Or maybe OGAS was just, the wrong idea at the wrong time.
Right. Right.
But either way, it's a fascinating story.
Absolutely, it really is.
And I think it's a story that has a lot to teach us even today
Yeah, I totally agree.
about the power of technology, but also about its limits.
Right, and about the importance of understanding the context in which it's developed.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive on OGAS.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a fascinating look at the road not taken
It really has.
into the digital future, and who knows, maybe it holds some lessons for us as
Yeah.
we kind of chart our own course
Right.
through this crazy digital age.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
All right, well, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.